Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's program. We have a terrific lineup of both live stream and in-person programming that's on our website, which I will highlight at the end of tonight's program. But if you don't have time to wait to the very end, please go to our website and check it out. We hope that you are enjoying our diverse and quality programming and the opportunity to engage with experts like Dan Schnur in civil and informative discussions. We can't do this without your ongoing viewership and support, so please consider making a donation today and become a member. Again, all of this can be found on our website. It's now my pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur, political professor at UC Berkeley, USC, and Pepperdine. He has a great program for you all tonight. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, great to see you.
Wow, what a hot day.
You can say that again.
Well, we have a terrific topic for you all, Trump versus the FBI, what comes next. And I think you all know the Q&A process here. Rachel Kenderdine, our community manager and digital producer, will manage the questions during the Q&A portion in about half an hour. So if you could just enter your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Rachel will manage that with Dan later in the program. A lot to cover, a lot to unpack, Dan, here.
Oh, Kim, when you said it was a hot day, I know you weren't just talking meteorologically. And yep. When you said that there was a lot to cover, although these programs, as you know, and our audience knows, Kim, are really about analysis more than news. There actually is some breaking news on this FBI investigation that I saw that's been out for just a few minutes on the Washington Post website, and I saw it just before our program began. So I thought that before going into our broader analysis, I'd update our audience who might not have been online just over the last several minutes, because the Washington Post is reporting just in the last 10, 15 minutes that a document describing a foreign government's military defenses, including its nuclear capability, was found by the FBI agents who searched Mar-a-Lago last month, according to people familiar with the matter. And some of the seized documents detail not only top secret U.S. operations that are so closely guarded that many senior national security officials are kept in the dark about them, because these questions of nuclear capabilities of foreign powers are so sensitive. The Post reported that only the president and some members of his cabinet could authorize other government officials to even know the details of these special access programs. In other words, these documents aren't just top secret, they're on what's called a need-to-know basis, which is even a higher level of confidentiality than the top secret documents we've been reading about for the last several weeks. Anyway, so that's the news. And let's take a step back now. And as we generally do when we gather for these monthly conversations, let's take a look at the broader picture. Because if you think about it, it was almost exactly a month ago, just 28 days ago, that the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, of course, the residence of former President Trump. And the search warrant application, as most of you know, was authorized by the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland. It was approved by a Florida judge by the name of Bruce Reinhart, but it came out of a criminal referral from the National Archives and Records Administration. And the order was unsealed a few days after the search, and it showed that the FBI got the search warrant as part of a broader investigation into Trump relating to 3 federal criminal statutes. And I want to go through those 3 statutes fairly carefully, because we're going to come back to them in a few minutes to talk about both the substantive and the political import of each. So 3 federal criminal statutes that drove this investigation. The first is violations of the Espionage Act regarding unauthorized possession of national defense information of the type that I just mentioned a moment ago. Second, destroying or concealing records, quote, with the intent to impede, obstruct, or influence, unquote, federal government activity. And this is obstruction of justice. And then third, illegal removal or destruction of federal government records from their proper safekeeping without respect to cause. So three different statutes, all with different levels of substantive policy and political import. And we'll come back to those in just a few minutes. But even though it's only been 4 weeks since this first happened, it's worth remembering that back in early August, this originally took place only about 2 weeks after the 8th and final hearing, the final for now hearing, of the Congressional January 6th Committee. And at that last hearing, we saw former White House staff, national security officials, and Trump cabinet members all testifying, both about Trump's actions on January 6, 2021, and his actions in pressuring Vice President Pence to overturn the election results. Now, that was about 6 weeks ago, and that was the culmination of a summer-long blockbuster series of revelations from the House committee. And each of you should ask yourself, when is the last time you even thought about the January 6th hearings? I mean, Biden mentioned them in his Philadelphia speech last week, but before that, it's probably been a while. Now, as you all know, this was the first assault on the US Capitol since the War of 1812. Millions of Americans were just riveted to these hearings for months. And now they're barely mentioned at all because they've been almost completely overshadowed by the FBI investigations, and that's where we'll focus our conversation today. Okay, so if we can, Katie, can we put up our first question for the group to consider? Okay, this one's pretty straightforward. Given what we just talked about, which incident is of greater concern to you? Was it the Capitol insurrection itself back on January 26th of last year? Second, was it the classified documents that Donald Trump took to Mar-a-Lago? Third, do you consider both incidents to be of equal concern and equal alarm? Or fourth, conversely, like many Americans, would you say that neither one of these bothers me very much at all, certainly not one more than the other? So, Katie, let's take a look and see how we did with our answers once they've come in. Okay, very interesting. Look at that. 82%, more than 4 out of 5 of our respondents say that both are equally alarming. In the smaller numbers, by a 2-to-1 margin, the January 6th insurrection is judged to be of greater import than the documents. But here we are watching news coverage just being dominated by the FBI investigation into these confidential documents. And of course, it's what we're going to talk about today. So good for you as a group for not losing track of what you consider to be the most important. But because we here at the World Affairs Council Town Hall, at least I tend to be somewhat of a headline chaser, we're going to keep on talking about the investigation, at least for the first half of the program. And then when Rachel joins me for the second half, which is my favorite, your questions and comments, if you like, we can go back to talking about the January 6th hearings, about the 2022 midterm elections, or anything else you like. But at least for now, I do want to dig a little bit further into these investigations, because even if you correctly assume that they are not going to be as of much import in the long run as the January 6th insurrection, it is entirely possible that charges brought as a result of the FBI investigation could end up having more legal impact on President Trump than any of the legal proceedings he's been facing to date on any number of other fronts. And now, in addition to being a serious legal and security matter, this is obviously a matter of great political import too. Now, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, ever since he was originally selected by President Biden to be the Attorney General, Garland goes to great lengths to be, I would call him, ostentatiously apolitical. He goes out of his way to let us know that he doesn't take sides in these things. He's been made it clear since his appointment that he doesn't see himself as a partisan advocate. And these events, this investigation, think demonstrates that Garland is not interested in whether his decisions have a political impact. And I go a step further. He hasn't really exhibited any interest in whether his decisions unite or divide the country. His job is to prosecute crimes. And if it leads to some type of political upheaval for the benefit of one party or the other, well, Garland really doesn't see that as part of his job to even consider that. Well, that might not be his job, but it's our job here to analyze the political ramifications of even nonpartisan actions. And there's no question that Garland's efforts to stay above the partisan fray doesn't avoid the political complications of moving forward. There are a lot of smart analysts in both parties who've said that a technical violation of the regulations that hasn't put the country in great danger could actually create somewhat of a political benefit for Trump by creating a backlash in his favor. And Trump himself has been out on the stump arguing that when the government comes after him, they can just as easily come after every American. So the emerging conventional wisdom from both Democrats and Republicans is that the best Justice Department can't just have a technical violation of one of those statutes, but they need to have a very strong case to avoid the type of backlash that Trump and his allies are obviously working very hard to engender. But before we go any further, Katie, if you can join me again with our second question, let's see what our group thinks about this. So there are obviously huge political ramifications here, but let's get a sense from our group as to whether and how those political considerations ought to be weighed as the legal case does or does not move forward. Option one, where we said the question is, should Trump's case be handled differently because he's a former president? Option one, yes, he should be treated more deferentially because of his former office. And that gets to questions of executive privilege, and we'll talk more about that later as it relates to Judge Cannon's decision last Friday. Option two, yes, this should be handled differently because Trump should be held to higher standards because of his former office. In other words, he shouldn't be treated more deferentially, but he should be held to a higher standard of propriety than the average citizen might be. Third, our third alternative is Trump should not be treated differently than any other individual in the same position. These statutes don't separate out the chief executive for better or worse, and statutes regarding obstruction of justice and mishandling of documents and so forth, these ought to proceed the same way whether the accused is a former president or not. And fourth, Trump should be treated the same legally, but the political considerations need to be weighed too as the Justice Department goes forward. So Katie, how did we do on this question? A little bit more intricate, but we'll see what our results are. And our results aren't quite as one-sided. 51%, just over half of our group, does not think Trump should be treated differently than any other individual in the same position. In other words, he shouldn't be given more deference because of executive privilege, but he also shouldn't be held to higher standards than any other citizen. The law is the law, says our group. 27%, second, are those who believe he ought to be treated legally, but the political considerations do need to be weighed by the Justice Department too. So if you combine those two, 78%, more than 3/4 of our group, do not believe Trump in this legal matter as a former president should be treated better or worse than any other citizen facing similar charges. Very interesting. So it now looks, as we move forward, and hopefully he will be treated in a court of law just as any other citizen, it's beginning to look like of those three statutes that I mentioned earlier, the prosecutors are likely to focus primarily on the question of obstruction of justice. Now, Trump's lawyers may have, there's accusations that have been made, Trump's lawyers may have given false information to the FBI. They have been accused of preventing agents from fully searching the property this summer and then hiding documents that remained at Mar-a-Lago when the FBI left. And any one of those would qualify as obstruction of justice. And the prosecutors wrote in their report, and I quote, they said, quote, records were likely concealed and removed and efforts were likely taken to obstruct the government's investigation, unquote. That is obstruction of justice. Now, the FBI started investigating way back in May. And with subpoenas, the agents went to Mar-a-Lago and they met with Trump's lawyers. They recovered 38 documents marked classified. And a Trump representative signed a statement certifying that all the material at Mar-a-Lago with classification markings had been returned to the government. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. The FBI kept investigating and it found evidence that boxes and boxes had been moved before the prosecutors said they did a search for classified material. The agents were concerned that some of the government's top secrets, including the type of nuclear secrets I mentioned at the beginning of the program, were still in Trump's possession. So the agents, as I said a moment ago, got a search warrant and recovered more than 100 classified documents, including some so secret that, according to the filing, even FBI counterintelligence personnel and Department of Justice attorneys had to get additional clearance themselves before they were even allowed to look at those documents. So now remember, this is all in addition to the 15 boxes that the National Archives officials took from the property this year. And when the government released a very heavily redacted version of its affidavit that justified searching Mar-a-Lago, it showed that the archives had recovered 184 documents marked classified months before the FBI got involved. So once again, of the 3 original charges, violations of the Espionage Act, illegal removal or destruction of federal government records, and obstruction of justice, it looks like that intent to impede, obstruct, or influence federal government activity is the one where the Justice Department is focusing most of its efforts. Now, they say in politics, or at least they have ever since Watergate, they say that the cover-up is always worse than the crime. But we don't know if voters will feel that way, or if the obstruction charges will concern them as much as charges of espionage or destruction of government records might. So the leak that came out just a few minutes ago that I read at the beginning of this program about nuclear secrets having been part of the trove of documents that the FBI did recover in its search of Mar-a-Lago, that's really important, because not only does it raise the political stakes for Trump by putting him and his allies on the defensive, but it potentially creates a much more compelling, well, not a much more compelling legal case in the court of law, but a much more legal case for public and political consumption by focusing on espionage rather than obstruction. Now, we're going to come back to the political impact in just a minute, but there's just a few other points I wanted to make sure we covered. 3 other points. 1, there's still no evidence that Trump declassified any of this before he took it. Now, Trump and his lawyers have been saying all along that he declassified all these documents before taking them to Mar-a-Lago. And it is worth acknowledging a president does have the authority to declassify anything he wants. But a former president doesn't have that power. And the prosecutors say that Trump's lawyers have never argued that in court or in conversation or correspondence with the Justice Department about the documents. And while it's true that presidents have very broad declassification powers, that's not for everything. And there's a very involved and intricate process and paperwork that needs to happen when the president says, I want that declassified. So far, there's no evidence of that. We'll see if Trump or witnesses appearing on his behalf once this trial gets underway are able to point to some evidence that, in fact, that Trump did declassify these documents while still in office. Second, we still don't know why Trump took and apparently insisted on keeping these documents. That's not really relevant from a legal standpoint, but politically, it's one of the biggest mysteries of this whole question, of this whole story. Trump resisted handing much of anything over to the government early on, to the point where his supporters thought that he was basically daring the FBI to come after them. And in other words, that Trump wanted to create a political confrontation with Biden's Justice Department because he felt that would work to his partisan advantage. Now, it's been reported quite a bit over the years that Trump is not an especially voracious reader. So it's not clear what it was about these documents that motivated him to have them removed from the White House and then to fight against their return. And until we have a better sense of what's in those documents, that's going to be an almost impossible question to answer, but perhaps not legally, but politically, a critically important one. And that leads to question number 3, the decision by Judge Eileen Cannon just last Friday to appoint a special master to review these documents, not only for attorney-client privilege, which is fairly standard, but possibly executive privilege. Now, this case is being appealed, or it will be appealed very shortly, it seems, by the Justice Department. And we'll know very soon whether Judge Cannon's decision will be upheld by the type of 3-judge panel that normally reviews these appeals. But either way, while this special master appointment has the ability to slow the case, it's not very likely to affect the ultimate outcome. And even while the documents are being held for review, it's worth remembering that Judge Cannon has allowed a separate review of the documents by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to continue. And that's the important one. That review is much more impactful because what that review by the Director of National Intelligence is doing isn't just examining attorney-client privilege or even executive privilege. That review is assessing the risk to national security that the insecure holding of sensitive documents that Mar-a-Lago may have caused. And those are the questions that pack the most impact politically. So since we're talking politics, Katie's a step ahead of me. Good for you, Katie. It's about time we got to the 3rd question. Since we're talking politics, it's worth noting that the midterm elections are almost 2 months away. And this is an issue, obviously, that could play very big on voters' decisions. So question for our group, how much will this whole controversy impact the midterm elections? And when I say controversy, I mean not just the FBI investigation, but the January 6th hearings and all things related to Trump. So how much will these controversies impact the midterms? Will they strongly help the Democrats? Will they slightly help the Democrats? Conversely, will they strongly help the Republicans? Will they slightly help the Republicans? Or will it not really have a partisan impact that helps, at least not one that helps one side or the other? Okay, what have we gotten from our group here? What did our team of analysts have to say about this last question? Oh, look at that, very interesting. 64% say it will help the Democrats, but slightly. That's 4 times as many people who think it will strongly help the Democrats. Only 10% say it'll strongly or slightly help Republicans. Only 10% say it'll have a partisan impact. But add those 2 top categories up, and 80%, 4 out of 5 of our group believe that this is going to help the Democrats. Maybe not a huge amount, but at least to some degree. Now, many Democrats believe that talking about Trump is just an abstraction for many voters, and that their candidates, the Democratic candidates, should be focusing much more on so-called kitchen table issues, given voter concerns about inflation, about healthcare, about public safety, and other issues that are a lot more tangible and relevant to their daily lives. And this was the argument that arose in the Democratic circles after the 2016 election, when a lot of people felt that Hillary Clinton had been hurt by focusing so much on Trump rather than on policy matters. So Democrats are saying this Trump stuff is helpful, but it shouldn't be our candidate's main focus. Other Democrats, though, a growing number, in fact, see this debate over the documents, along with the investigation in January 6th, as a way of turning what's normally a referendum on the incumbent in midterm elections into a choice between Biden and Trump. Now let's talk about this for a minute. And we've discussed it on past webinars, but it's worth coming back to. Biden, for years and years and years before an election, he always likes to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And what he's basically saying is, don't compare me against some abstract ideal, compare me to the person I'm running against. And in midterm elections, we've seen over the last century, midterm elections generally do tend to be referenda on the incumbent. And because voters are never completely satisfied, almost always, as I think most of you know, almost always the result of midterm elections is to help the party that doesn't hold the presidency. And in fact, there have only been 3 midterm elections in the last century in which the president's party gained seats in Congress rather than lost them. The most recent of those was in 2002, just about a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, when George W. Bush and Republicans were emphasizing national security issues to such a degree that it did allow the Republicans, even while holding the White House, to achieve some small gains in Congress. In 1998 was the immediate aftermath of Bill Clinton's impeachment. And there was such a backlash against Republican overreach in the minds of most voters that the Democrats were actually able to gain a small number of seats in the House in the aftermath of impeachment. Before those two, though, you've got to go all the way back to 1934 midterm elections. And that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first midterms at the height of the Great Depression. Roosevelt, of course, was still at that point working very, very hard to pass the key components of the New Deal. And the voters, beset by such a horrible economic downturn, did increase his majority slightly in Congress. But that's it. 3 times in 100 years. Now, there was 3 elections out of the last 50 midterms where the president's party gained seats because a midterm ends up usually being a referenda on the incumbent. And the incumbent against an idealized alternative usually doesn't do that well. So what many Democrats are thinking, coming back to present day, is by highlighting the January 6th hearings, by highlighting the FBI investigation, they turn that referendum into a choice. And they believe that just as Biden prevailed in a choice between Biden and Trump in 2020, they believe that by framing this midterm election in a similar fashion, that they can accomplish the same thing this year. And in fact, over the last few months, we've seen national public opinion polls show that a hypothetical 2024 campaign between Biden and Trump that was looking pretty close to even back in the spring, Biden has now opened up a mid-single digit 5-6 point advantage in most national polls. So certainly not insurmountable, but Democrats are thinking, at least some Democrats are thinking, let's make Trump the centerpiece. And that way we can make this election into a choice the same way we did in 2020. Now, of course, these 3 previous midterms where the president's party gained seats, 1934, 1998, and 2002, they all represented extraordinary circumstances. The Great Depression, a presidential impeachment, 9/11 terrorist attacks. All were extraordinary circumstances. So the question to consider heading into these midterms, is Donald Trump an extraordinary circumstance? And the answer, of course, is yes. We just don't know in which direction that extraordinary circumstance plays and who it benefits. Now, finally, of course, the other extraordinary circumstance on this political landscape is the Supreme Court decision a few months back to overturn Roe versus Wade. The Dobbs decision seems to have energized Democrats, especially Democratic women and young people, and perhaps to perhaps unprecedented levels. We, of course, talked about the Dobbs decision on this webinar a couple months ago, shortly after the decision was made. But since then, we're beginning to see more and more of the political impact of the decision. We're seeing more and more women register to vote, particularly in key swing states. And we're seeing large portions of the Democratic base, which has not been particularly excited about Joe Biden for the last year and a half or so, getting much more motivated, not because of Biden, but because of what they see as the import of this decision. Now, as many smart people have written, there is no precedent in our nation's history for the courts making a decision of this magnitude so close to an election. So it's impossible to predict whether this will turn out Democrats in unusually high numbers or not. I was citing poll numbers just a minute ago, but I will give you one quick warning on the polls. Public opinion polling, in order to be effective, needs to be able to assess whether a respondent is going to vote or not. And so as we get closer to election day, you'll begin seeing polls, not just of all registered voters, but of likely voters. And assessing on whether a voter is likely to turn out and will turn out is the real science of polling that determines whether public opinion research and surveys are accurate or not. And as I said earlier, we've had decades and decades of public opinion polling that attempting to estimate how likely a voter or voter group is to actually turn out on election day. But we've never, ever polled in the aftermath of such a seminal Supreme Court decision made so close to a key election. So I'm going to cite these polls all the way through until the election because I just can't help myself. But take those polls and me with a grain of salt, because on this very unpredictable, unprecedented political landscape, we really don't know from past history who's a likely voter and who's not. And we probably won't until November 8th or possibly sometime after that. Now, Republicans, for their part, they insist that while abortion will motivate some voters, other issues like inflation and immigration and crime, will motivate just as many, if not more, of their voters. And so the final question before we had to bring Rachel on and head to the second half of our program is, what do you think? What issue do all of you believe will have the greatest impact on the midterm elections? And so, Katie, if we can put up the fourth question for our group, there we go. All right. So Democrats have one opinion on what's going to motivate their voters. Republicans have other opinions on what they think will motivate their voters. And for all of you, as really smart analysts, the question is, what do you think will drive voters to the poll more than anything else on election day? Will it be these Trump-related controversies, as you see in the first option? Will it be inflation in the economy, as many are predicting? Will it be abortion and other healthcare-related issues, as we were just talking about? Will it be issues like immigration and crime, which still pack a very powerful punch, particularly the Republican base? Will it be something else that I didn't list here? We didn't list Ukraine, didn't list COVID. According to these polls I was talking about earlier, most voters, less than 1% of the American public, thinks COVID is an issue on which they will vote. Pretty incredible on how that's changed since the last election cycle. So, Katie, let's see what our group has given us on this final question. And I find that very interesting. Our analysts say 48%, almost half, believe that abortion and other healthcare-related issues, because of the Dobbs decision, will ultimately drive voter turnout, which would undoubtedly be very good for the Democrats, because polling is showing that Democrats, this is a historical anomaly, Democrats are much more motivated, historically Republicans, pro-life voters, are much more motivated to turn out on issues relating to abortion than Democrats. Looks like Dobbs may have flipped that. 36% say the inflation in the economy, though, and that's a pretty healthy number. That's more than a third. And looking at the polls, voters who do vote on economic and inflation-related issues, they're much more likely to vote Republican than Democrat. 15% say Trump and the issues you were talking about earlier. Only 1% say immigration and crime. And nobody called me out and said I didn't pick the issue that they thought was the most important one. So I will count that as a very small victory. With that very small victory, Katie, thank you very much for your help. And Rachel, thank you in advance for coming on. And let's you and I together weed through the questions that our smart audience has been sending us. What do you say?
Hi, Dan. That sounds great. Yeah, we have so many of them today. So I want to get to as many as possible. So I thought we could just jump right in.
Excellent.
But related to the search of Mar-a-Lago and the ongoing investigation, obviously very many questions about that. But given today's news, if Trump did declassify these documents, wouldn't that constitute gross negligence and a major security threat?
It certainly would. And the question is, what will be not only the legal, but the political impact of it? And, Rachel, as you know, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, while the security ramifications of Trump's decisions could be very profound, the question is to what degree they alarm the American public. And the idea that he may have taken top secret, beyond top secret information, need to know information about a foreign government's nuclear capacity could have an extraordinary impact. But I'll offer you this. That's probably going to be determined, the level of impact, based on what country it is. In other words, any of these documents are highly classified and should not be put in unsecure situations. Let's start with that. But in terms of the popular response to this, let's say for the sake of argument that Trump happened to take with him secrets relating to Great Britain's nuclear capacity. I don't know that that's going to really raise a whole lot of outrage on the American public. On the other hand, if it's information relating to North Korea or Iran, then that's a much bigger deal. So whoever leaked this out today did it very, very purposely to whet our appetites. And I'd be willing to bet money that long before a trial actually begins, we'll find out more details, including what country or countries these nuclear capabilities were related to. And that's going to tell us a lot more about the political and popular reaction.
Yeah, and kind of in the same vein related to today's news, one of our audience members asked, could the latest revelation you mentioned at the beginning of this session change the status of having a special master review the documents?
I don't think it will, because keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, while Judge Cannon has called for a special master to review these documents for attorney-client privilege and executive privilege, the really heavy security stuff is already being reviewed by national intelligence agencies. And Judge Cannon very specifically did not put a halt to that investigation. So either way, national intelligence and security experts are combing through those documents, looking for exactly this type of information, which is why I suspect that some of it leaked. But because Cannon was so specific in what her special master would oversee, I don't know that that appointment would have much impact on this. It would be very difficult for Donald Trump to claim, in other words, that nuclear secrets about a foreign power were the subject of attorney-client privilege.
Yeah, and we actually had, you mentioned Judge Cannon, several questions come in asking for your assessment of her. What does it mean for the case that she was appointed by Trump? And why was she not made to recuse herself?
Okay. So two really good questions there. First of all, Trump's lawyers actually filed this, not in Palm Beach court, which is only 12 miles from Mar-a-Lago, but they filed it in a court at the other end of the state because they knew they had a Trump-appointed judge up north. Now, judges decide for themselves whether or not to recuse themselves at every level of the judicial system. But simply being appointed by a president or governor of one party or the other is not in itself grounds for recusal. The presumption is that even if a judge is appointed by an elected official of one party or the other, that will not impact their decision-making. Sometimes judges will recuse themselves when they have a very close personal or professional relationship with that elected official, but much more often than not, judges appointed by politicians of both parties do not recuse themselves under these circumstances. Should Cannon have done so? Well, that's going to be argued back and forth in the textbooks for decades. And I suspect that most people who think that Trump didn't do anything wrong will think that she shouldn't have recused herself. And those people who did think that he did something wrong will think that she should have. But as I mentioned earlier in today's program, Rachel, there is also an appeal process. And it does look like the Justice Department is going to appeal. That appeal is going to be heard by a 3-judge panel. And there's no way to predict in advance whether the panel will overturn Cannon's decision or not. But even if the decision holds, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I don't see it as having a great impact on the ultimate outcome of the case. Legal scholars can make a persuasive case as to how unusual her decision was. In other words, had Cannon appointed a special master just to review for attorney-client privilege, that would have been fairly commonplace. By including executive privilege of Trump's former status as president, she was relying on a post-Watergate court decision that gave Richard Nixon, as former president, some very, very limited executive privilege in those contexts. That one's much more unusual and somewhat more controversial. But while this will, if it holds, while it will almost certainly slow down the case considerably, it's very difficult seeing how it does affect the ultimate outcome, because ultimately what national security officials are looking at in terms of the documents is going to be what determines the outcome of the case. If it moves slower, That's not ideal for those who want to see this resolved sooner rather than later. But again, I don't see the special master impacting how the case is ultimately decided when it's ultimately decided.
Thanks for that, Dan. And we have a number of questions about the appeal process for this decision as well. So one audience member asked, if the Justice Department appeals the ruling on the special master, could this eventually end up in the Supreme Court?
It could, and of course that would keep it on an even slower track. But once again, I think the thing to remember is that while this is an important decision by Judge Cannon, it's not determinative. What's going to be impacted by her decision and its the potential for its overrule is a question of timing, not a question of ultimate decision.
Well, that moves us into kind of our next set of questions, which is more about the upcoming elections and how—
I'm not surprised.
Yes, lots of questions coming in. So one audience member asked, could appointing a special master help Democrats in November because it's a way of reestablishing neutrality for the FBI in the public view?
Well, this has been one of the more interesting and potentially more effective arguments that Biden has been making over the last few weeks. Republicans, for most of modern history, have generally been able to position themselves very successfully as the party of law enforcement. And when you heard some of the more extreme voices in the Republican Party after the original search of Mar-a-Lago talking about defunding the FBI and so on, even a lot of Republicans were worried out loud that that kind of language could be very damaging. In other words, if you're the law and order party, defunding the Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't necessarily hold with that. Biden's made that case, and it appears, at least from polling, that while it almost certainly motivates his own base, that argument does have some effect with swing voters in the center of the political spectrum. Biden was actually fairly effective at neutralizing the crime issue in 2020, if you remember. The election took place, of course, in the aftermath of the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the subsequent protests. And Biden went out of his way, to the consternation of many progressive Democrats, to make it as clear as he possibly could all fall long of that year that he did not think defunding the police was a good idea. And a lot of smart analysts have come to the conclusion that one of the reasons Biden won, but so many Democrats in very close races lost, is because Biden was able to inoculate himself much more effectively against these soft on crime charges that were being thrown against him. We'll see over the next 9 weeks whether Democrats in close races this year are able to insulate from those kind of charges as effectively as Biden did in 2020, or with some of them end up being susceptible to it. But I would say that the more that even a small number of Republicans talk about defunding the FBI, the more that helps a centrist Democrat protect themselves from those kind of allegations on this issue. And it's sort of ironic, before we move on, there were always some Democratic politicians, but not a large number, who called for defending the police, and that ended up being an issue that ended up hurting the party on a much wider basis. Here you have a very small number of Republicans talking about defunding the FBI. And even though most Republicans, like most Democrats, don't share the more extreme position, the question is whether they might be potentially tarred with the same brush. I'm not smart enough to predict that outcome, but if it were to happen, it would certainly be very ironic.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. It's so interesting to think about. One question, kind of pivoting back to the documents themselves a little bit in terms of the elections. If Trump were to announce his candidacy for president in 2024, would that offer him any sort of added protection with respect to the issues identified in the Mar-a-Lago search?
No one knows. There's no precedent for this. In other words, it's intricate enough, as we've learned from Judge Cannon's decision, what kind of protections are available to a former president. It's impossible to predict what kind of legal protections would exist for a presidential candidate. I think the much more impactful questions, though, than the legal route forward would be the political impact. Because if Trump is an active and declared candidate for president, legal proceedings against him would hypercharge the politics of the debate to an even greater degree. And I think there are real concerns among many Democrats that if Trump were declared candidate and the Justice Department were proceeding against him, that it in fact could, to a very significant degree, inflame Trump's base to a level to be beneficial to him. Now, part of the trick here is in the timing. It's been reported that many Republicans, including House Leader Kevin McCarthy, have been begging Trump not to announce his candidacy for president before November, because they believe, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that if Trump is a declared candidate for president, that makes the election even more of a choice between Trump, this election in 2022, even more of a choice between Biden and Trump, rather than an up or down referendum on Biden. So it looks as if McCarthy and his allies have been successfully able to convince Trump that announcing a presidential campaign before these midterms is not a good idea. But as the legal proceedings go forward, the questioner makes a good point. The former president could see a real temptation to do so, not for legal protections, but for political benefit.
Pivoting a bit for our next question to another topic that's obviously a huge one of discussion. So given the decision in Kansas last month to keep abortion legal and the very high voter turnout there, is there anything we can learn from that special election moving into midterm season?
Well, the state of Kansas, which, although they have a Democratic governor, has historically tended to be a fairly conservative state over the years with a very strongly pro-life electorate, had an election, had a ballot initiative that the voters passed by an overwhelming margin, for those of you who weren't familiar with it, over the summer. Before the Dobbs decision, public opinion polling was showing the initiative running fairly close to even, a few points ahead, but not that much. And then in the weeks after Dobbs, we began to see a very major shift in polling. And a lot of strategists in both parties look at not just the Kansas referendum, but a series of special elections that have taken place since the Dobbs decision came down a few months ago. Special elections for the House of Representatives in which Democratic candidates did much better than expected. They see all of those campaigns as potential warning signs for Republicans that the Dobbs decision may have awakened a sleeping pro-choice giant. Most notably, there's a special election just a couple of weeks ago in New York State for an empty congressional seat. And this was a seat that had been held by a Republican office holder before he stepped down. The Democrat ran almost completely on an abortion rights and reproductive rights platform and was able to win the race. And so as we're seeing these early elections show a larger turnout for pro-choice voters, it does have a lot of analysts agreeing in both parties that this is an issue that's going to help the Democrats in November. The question I would suggest isn't whether Democrats will be helped by the Dobbs decision, but how much. Because it is worth remembering that earlier this year, Democrats were in a very, very deep hole for all the reasons having to do with midterm elections that we talked about earlier. Back last spring, it was thought that Republicans were very strongly favored to regain majorities in both the Senate and the House. Now, most analysts are regarding the Senate as a pure toss-up. It could go either direction. And I know smart people who think that it could, after all this is said and done, still be a 50-50 tie after the November election. But while it appears that Democrats will not suffer as sweeping losses as their party feared back in the spring, it still looks like it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats in the House to actually maintain the majority. So Dobbs does help. Again, the question is how much.
Great. And pivoting a bit again to talk about the January 6th hearings and situation there. So this is relatively recent news. I'm not sure if you've seen it yet. But a decision came out a few hours before our program where a New Mexico judge removed a county official from office for participating in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The judge determined that it was an insurrection and he can't hold office under the terms of the 14th Amendment. Sorry, that was a lengthy setup, but can you comment on that and how it may impact precedent moving forward?
Well, the court case is a fascinating one, because ever since the 14th Amendment was passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Constitution has stated that an elected official who engages in that type of an insurrection against the government is ineligible to hold office. And there have been a number of individuals who've suggested that Trump himself should be declared ineligible to run for president again in 2024 because his opponents allege that he was instigating that insurrection on January 6, 2021. The individual who was removed from office in New Mexico, held a county level office, was also the chair of an organization called Cowboys for Trump, for the record. There are some who are arguing that this now sets a precedent. It's the first time since World War I that this has been employed against a sitting office holder. A member of Congress was removed in the 19-teens for being a declared socialist. And so this is the first time since then that this step has been taken. There are those who would argue that because a county level official was removed from office, that members of Congress who were very active on January 6th, some of the former president's strongest supporters, and Trump himself could end up being declared either removed from office or declared ineligible for the same reason. I think it's pretty unlikely. There's no way to know for certain, but it's difficult to see federal courts coming to the same conclusion based on this New Mexico decision. So it's an interesting case, and I'd encourage our listeners to read about it if they haven't. But I would be extremely surprised if it ended up having federal ramifications for Trump or for members of Congress.
Thanks for that, Dan. Another question, going back to our topic for the evening of Trump and the FBI, how do you interpret the Republican reticence in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago circumstances?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Rachel?
Yeah, the audience member asked, how do you interpret the Republican reticence in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago circumstances?
Okay. Well, if you look back at the way the story has played out since the search of Mar-a-Lago first became public in early August, for those first few days, many Republicans were very vocal in their outrage against the FBI and the Justice Department. And the questioner's point is the right one. Since then, not all Republicans, but many of them have become much more quiet. And the most likely explanation, we won't know until the case proceeds, but the most plausible explanation from my standpoint is that as those Republican leaders, like the rest of us, learn more about what may have been included in these documents, the more nervous they get about defending Trump. It's one thing to accuse the FBI or the Justice Department of overreach, but if in fact, going back to today's news, it turns out that there were nuclear secrets down in a storage room in Mar-a-Lago, it's only a very, very small number of Trump loyalists who will continue to defend him. Because even for a Republican who would like to see Trump run for and get elected president again, that's a much more tenuous position to take, to suggest that there was nothing wrong with having those documents available in such an insecure setting. So as more information comes out about what those documents possess, I think that's why the number of Republicans defending Trump has become most noticeably smaller.
And just another question about the elections. Obviously, we've had many tonight. But this audience member asks, what political impact will there be if Trump-endorsed candidates fail? Does this open the field for additional Republican presidential candidates?
I think it does. It's very clear that Trump is not going to have an unimpeded path to the 2024 Republican nomination, no matter what. It seems that Governor DeSantis is going to run against him. And I would be surprised if there are not several other Republican candidates, regardless of the outcome of these elections. Now, if Trump's supporters are more successful in November than many observers currently suspect, that probably makes Trump a stronger candidate in the 2024 primary. But it's difficult to envision a situation in which so many Trump supporters win in 2022 that Trump himself would face no primary opposition in 2024. I think it's almost certain that he will face not just one, but a number of opponents. And although we'll talk more about this on September 15th, shameless plug for those of you who'd like to join us for breakfast at Akasha on the morning of September 15th, my good friend Conan Nolan, the political reporter for KNBC, and I are going to be talking local, state, and national politics at breakfast that day. And I'm sure we'll get into not just 2022, but 2024 on the 15th also, don't you think, Rachel? So I'll offer this now, and we can talk about it more in depth for those of you who do join us for the breakfast. Remember that in 2020, no other Republican primary opponent really confronted Trump until the very end of the primary process. At the very end, Marco Rubio and John Kasich started to make a little bit of noise against him. But for months and months and months, most of the other Republicans stayed out of Trump's way because they all knew that there was no way he could possibly be the nominee. And they felt if they weren't attacking him, their goal was to be the second person standing along with Trump, because that person would clearly become the Republican nominee for president. In 2024, there might not be as many Republicans running as there were in 2020. But those that do are not going to give Trump the kind of free ride that they did 4 years ago. And so not only am I confident that there will be a field of much larger than one candidates for the Republican nomination in 2 years, but it will be a much more contentious primary in both directions than it had been 4 years ago, or 4 years earlier, excuse me.
Well, that pretty much wraps up our time for tonight, Dan. Thank you so much. I do have one final fun question.
Oh, good.
That came in from an audience member who asked, when will Dan write a book so we can see it on the shelf behind him?
That's a very nice compliment. In the meantime, I'd be more than happy to recommend most, if not all, of the books behind me. And anybody who does want reading recommendations, just send us an email. And I'll not only send you the books that I assigned to my class, which are back there, but some of the other more interesting political readings. And when there is a by Dan Schnur book, you bet I'll come on these webinars and shamelessly pitch it. But in the meantime, I'll be happy to help sell others. What a great question to close on.
Well, thank you so much again, Dan. And yeah, we're looking forward to September 15th when we do discussing the elections. But I'll bring Kim back on and she can tell us more about that too.
Well, it's great to see you, Rachel. Thanks as always for all your great work, and to Katie as well for hers.
Thanks, Dan.
I just have to echo a big thank you to Rachel and Katie, who make this production process look so easy and seamless. So thank you both. Dan, terrific discussion tonight. Well, why don't you hang on with me and let's talk about some of the upcoming programs we have.
Definitely.
That you all can check out on our website. Katie and Rachel have posted and updated the website, so please check it out. On September 13th, we have The Road Taken with Senator Patrick Leahy. So that's a live stream, so don't miss that. And of course, one more plug for Dan on September 15th. This is a breakfast. It's our fall election kickoff. What should we expect in the midterm elections with Dan Schnur and Conan Nolan? On the 23rd, we have Always Faithful with Major Tom Schumann. This is just a heartwarming, positive story of his bond as a Marine with his Afghan interpreter. So this is one of those happy, fun, well, I won't say fun, but it's a positive view of his experience.
And if I may, Kim, just to plug not only our program on September 15th, but Senator Leahy. I know that some of our audience members know this, but perhaps not all do. But until Senator Leahy retires, he is actually fourth in line for succession for the US presidency. After Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi, fourth in the line of succession is not the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, but rather the Senate President Pro Tem, the member of the majority party who has served the longest in who served the longest, and that's Senator Leahy. So you never know, you might get to see an acting president if you show up for that conversation.
Thanks, Dan. Great addition. On the October 4th, we have our Distinguished Speaker Series with Stedman Graham, who is the significant other of Oprah, who is a accomplished businessman in his own right. So for you who are members, this will be a very exclusive special lunch at the California Club. So check that one out. And of course, October 4th, that evening, we're back with the Dan Schnur Political Report. And on October 17th, we have Geostrategic Trends in the Indo-Pacific, which is a live stream. So check out our website. Please make a donation. Help us keep these free live streams going by supporting our staff. And take care. And for those of you who aren't members, all of us who are going to be joining Dan right after this program for a more in-depth, interactive discussion on today's topic and other topics. So we hope to see you on September 13th for Senator Leahy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody.